When we think about government debt, we usually have a pretty simple rule in our heads. Spending more than you earn, well, that's a problem. But what if, for some countries, the story is actually much, much weirder than that? Today, we are diving into some fascinating research that pretty much flips our basic ideas about public debt completely on their head. So let's get into it. Here's the big question we're tackling. Could the standard playbook for managing national debt just be wrong for a specific group of countries? And look, this isn't just some academic thought experiment. It has huge, real-world implications for how entire economies are run. We're about to see a case where the normal laws of economic gravity seem to work a little differently. Okay, so our story zooms in on a very specific group of nations, what economists call the transition economies. These are countries that had to pull off one of the most massive economic shifts in modern history. And as you're about to see, their journey with debt has been unlike anything else. So who are we actually talking about here? Well, this group is made up of 27 countries, mostly in Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltics. Starting in the 1990s, they had to basically rebuild their economies from the ground up, privatizing huge state-owned companies, creating brand new legal systems, and just trying to stabilize everything. The research is clear. You can't understand their situation without understanding that socialist past. It makes them a totally unique case to study. You can really think of their economic story as a three-act play. Act 1, the late 90s, was the rocky start. I mean, countries like Russia and Bulgaria were wrestling with massive debt and crazy high inflation. Then Act 2 was the boom years in the early 2000s. Global growth was strong, and their debt actually went down. But then came Act 3, the great slowdown after 2009. The European debt crisis hit, and boom, their debt levels started climbing all over again. This wild roller coaster ride is the backdrop for our whole mystery. So, a couple of researchers, Carlos Carrasco and Edgar Tovar Garcia, basically put on their detective hats. They looked at this whole 24-year period across all 27 of these countries and asked a really simple question. What was actually causing these huge swings in government debt? They started, like any good detective, by lining up the usual suspects. And if you open any economics textbook, these 5 things are always the prime suspects. You got government deficits, right? Spending more than you get. Then there are interest rates, how fast the economy is growing, that's GDP growth, inflation, and of course the value of the country's currency. Seems pretty straightforward. Surely one of these has to be the main culprit, right? Just take a look at that list again. If you were a betting person, which one would you put your money on as the biggest driver of debt? I think most economists would probably point their fingers at the first 2. But as it turns out, the real answer is not so simple. And this is where our story takes a really sharp turn. The powerful statistical analysis in this study came back with a verdict that was, and I'm not exaggerating here, a complete shock. It pretty much challenged everything we thought we knew. Okay, check this out. Here's the first huge surprise. For this group of countries, government deficits and interest rates, the 2 things we always blame for rising debt, were statistically insignificant. Just let that sink in for a second. The 2 main culprits weren't the main story. So what was? Well, the real drivers were GDP growth and inflation. A growing economy and rising prices were actually the biggest forces shrinking their debt. But believe it or not, that wasn't even the weirdest part of the findings. There was one more clue, this one tied to the exchange rate, that turned economic logic completely on its head. And that brings us to the most mind-bending part of this whole thing. The exchange rate was a big factor, but it seemed to be working backwards. This is the paradox. Normally, if your country's currency gets weaker, any money you've borrowed from other countries becomes way more expensive to pay back. Your debt gets worse, not better. But the data here showed the complete opposite. A weaker currency was linked to a lower debt-to-GDP ratio. I mean, how on earth is that possible? To get our heads around this, we need to talk about something economists call original sin. It's this classic trap that a lot of developing countries fall into. They can't borrow money internationally in their own currency, so they have to borrow in US dollars or euros. The problem is, if their own local currency takes a nosedive, the real value of that foreign debt just explodes. That's the standard rule. So how do these countries break that rule? The answer is one word: Eurozone. A whole bunch of these nations, think Slovenia, Slovakia, the Baltic states, eventually joined the euro, and that was an absolute game changer. All of a sudden, they could borrow in a major global currency that was also their own home currency. They had escaped the original sin trap. And the result of that was this completely topsy-turvy situation. Because they'd gotten rid of that traditional currency risk, when other currencies around the world got weaker, it can actually make their euro-based debt seem smaller in comparison. The risk got flipped on its head. And we don't even have to guess if this is the reason. The researchers proved it. As they say right in the paper, and I'm quoting here, excluding Eurozone post-transition countries from our regression analysis renders the exchange rate insignificant. In other words, as soon as they took the Eurozone countries out of the data, that whole weird exchange rate effect just vanished. It was the Eurozone membership causing the strange result all along. So, what's the big takeaway here? What does this all mean for the real world? If the old rulebook for debt doesn't really apply to these countries, what should the new playbook look like? All right, here's the bottom line from this whole investigation. First, for these economies, job number one is stable GDP growth. It's still the most powerful tool there is for keeping debt under control. Second, while you never want crazy high inflation, this analysis showed it did help eat away at the real value of their debt. Third, and this is maybe the biggest lesson, joining a big currency union like the Eurozone can totally change a country's relationship with debt. And finally, while deficits always matter, this research proves they aren't always the main character in the story. The story of these transition economies is just a powerful reminder that in economics, context is everything. And it leaves us with one last really fascinating question to think about. In a world where economic alliances are always shifting, are we going to see more and more countries find their own unique ways to break the old established rules of government debt? The answer is anything but clear.